Welcome to episode 8 of Extremely Non-Extreme. I am Quentin Whitrock, the host of the program. As we wrap up the summer vacation season this Labor Day weekend, I thought this would be an appropriate time for an episode focusing on America's national parks. What does that have to do with politics, you ask? Well, you probably assume, correctly, that the parks are managed by an agency of our federal government. The National Park Service falls within the U.S. Department of Interior, of which Doug Burgum is the secretary and thus serves as a member of President Trump's cabinet. This podcast episode will explore how politics impact the national parks as an example of how politics impact everything our federal government does. My guest today is Paul Cross. In addition to being a Lutheran minister with multiple degrees in theology, Paul is a self-made expert on America's national parks. He did this by going there and by reading and researching. He also hails from the Washington, D.C. area, which gives him a natural instinct for federal politics. Lastly, Paul happens to live in North Dakota, the same state as Secretary Burgum and the home of one national park, Theodore Roosevelt, two national trails, one historical and one scenic, and two national historical sites. Welcome to the program, Paul Cross.
Well, thank you, Quentin. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm delighted you asked me. I do need to make one correction to you in your introduction.
Uh-oh.
I would describe myself not as an expert or even a self-made expert. I would describe myself as a national park hobbyist with a strong opinion, and that pretty much is a better description. Uh, in terms of the scope of my national park traveling, I've been of the current 433 national park units, I've physically been at 317, which is just a bit under 75%. And I've been to, of the national parks, which are most people understand as parks, like Yosemite and Yellowstone, places like that. Of the 63 that are designated as parks, I've been to 51. So I have some experience, let me say that. But expert, as I said, hobbyist with a strong opinion.
All right. Well, very well. And I do want your opinions. You're certainly more of an expert than I am, and many of the people who will be listening. So we'll learn a lot from you. Now, economist Milton Friedman quipped that if the government were put in charge of the Sahara Desert, there would be a shortage of sand within 5 years. My question, Paul, is since we do put the U.S. government in charge of our national parks and monuments and units and such, do we have a shortage of them, or is the opposite true, that we have too many?
Well, as I mentioned, there are 433 of them. That does seem like a great deal. And if there are 50 states, you do the math. Only the thing is they're not equally distributed. How they initially became distributed is, an interesting story. But how they're currently distributed or how they come into being certainly is a matter of politics. Uh, National park units, and I'll call them that, is come into being in two ways. One, either through congressional authority, or number two, and certainly very commonly used, is the Antiquities Act, wherein the President of the United States has the power to basically make an executive decision to declare a specific piece of federally owned land a national monument, or a national monument specifically. So yes, it is certainly a political thing of the federal government to do this. Um, However, the history of the national parks is not necessarily straightforward, and let me just say that from the outset, there's nothing particularly straightforward about the National Park Service in any way, shape, or form. Um, you would think that there would be. You'd think it'd be pretty clear, but it's not.
Okay, we'll talk more about that. It sounds like you are as a hobbyist, a collector of national parks and national monuments and
Yes.
the various units. And I am so impressed by that. So I think we should play a little game. And this
Okay.
is a game mostly for our listeners to play along.
Yes.
So what I am going to do is say the name of a place. And the listeners will pause for a second after I say each place, and we'll give the listeners to debate with whoever they're listening with. Maybe they're in the car and they could say, I think that's a national park, or I don't think that's a national park. And then you'll give the correct answer if you know the one that I name. And some of these I've made up. I'm just warning you. So, Pastor Cross, you can be our judge here and set the record straight. The first one I'll throw out on the table is Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri. Listeners, what do you think? Paul, Gateway
It,
Arch, is that a national park or not?
it is not only a national park unit, it is actually a national park. Yes.
All right. And that, as I understand it, started out as a national monument in 1965, and then it became a national park. And it's a man made structure. Is that unusual that a man made structure would be a national park?
Yeah, as far as having the specific designation of national park, yes, specifically for the purpose of that. It's as a park, yes. As a memorial, because there are numerous national park units in Washington, D.C., which are memorials. The Statue of Liberty is also a man-made structure that is a part of the National Park Service. And so it's not completely out of hand, but it is unusual. The Statue of Liberty is not a national park; it's a part of unit. And again, that's part of that straightforwardness. The National Park Service has many designations for these things, and they get quite convoluted. But in terms of something being a park, the other interesting thing about that one is that it started out as the Jefferson expansion. The idea that Thomas Jefferson had purchased the Louisiana on behalf of the United States involved the Louisiana Purchase, but somehow Jefferson's name got removed from the monument, which kind of is curious, but that's neither here nor there.
Interesting.
Well, actually, it
Well,
is. I shouldn't say it's neither here nor there because it's not always straightforward.
here's one that is partially man made in a sense and partially natural. Mount Rushmore. Okay. Paul, what do you say?
Mount Rushmore most assuredly is a part of the National Park Service. It is not a national park, but it is a part of the National Park Service, so it is a national park unit. Yes, it is.
Okay. That has the faces of the four presidents carved on it on the face of a small mountain.
And again,
Ah,
Jefferson is one of those, but again, it's not specifically for Jefferson.
interesting. Fenway Park. You used to be a Red Sox fan, Paul. Is Fenway Park a national park?
Anyone who knows Quentin, I could not dream of going against Quentin in terms of the number of the number of Major League Baseball parks have they been to. But I have been to Fenway Park, and it is not a national park. It should be, but it's not.
I read that it was on the National Register of Historic Places, and I'm sure that's a vastly different kettle of fish.
Oh, it most assuredly is. Oh my.
Cuyahoga Valley. Listeners, have you been there? And is that a national park? Paul Cross, what do you say?
Well, Cuyahoga Valley, I have been there. I do wonder why it is a national park. That's a great question for me. It is south of Cleveland. I mean, it's probably more be suburban Cleveland, and it is indeed a national park, and it is one of the 63 parks. Yes, of the National Park Service. Yes, but as to why it is one is beyond me.
And what about it makes you question why it is a national park? Is it
Uh,
different from Yosemite and Yellowstone and the others?
Well, I would say it's significantly different. The two things about this unit. There is a waterfall there, but as Quentin, you live in the Twin Cities, and there's a pretty magnificent waterfalls in Minnehaha Park, but it's certainly not a national park. Uh, and then there's a rail train that goes in, but I think it has to do more with this river that got cleaned up. That at one time, you may remember that it was on fire, and so as to how these things become national parks like this is the one that I probably have the greatest questions about. You know, uh, uh, that's my opinion. As I said, I'm a hobbyist with strong opinions, and I would question this particular one. But again, if I was a resident of Cleveland, I would fight tooth and nail to have this on the list of national parks.
I'm sure some politicians from Ohio did exactly that, and that
It
is
wouldn't have happened any other way.
it was probably a favor to someone. If you vote in favor of this bill that I want, then I'll support your bill to make your suburbs a national park.
It is a curious one.
Yes, Bear Ears. Listeners, have you ever heard of Bear Ears? Paul, I'm sure you have.
I have been to Bear Ears, but it is not a national park nor part of the national park. There has been an attempt to make Bear Ears a part. It's actually a part of the Bureau of Land Management, and it's quite controversial. Uh, uh, the previous couple administrations have been kind of going back and forth with the Antiquities Act, trying to make this case. It's a beautiful place, and again, it's a good example to show you that not all federal land is managed the same way. You have the United States Forest Service, which manages federal land through the Department of Agriculture. Then you have the Bureau of Land Management, which manages federal land through the Department of the Interior. Then you have the National Park Service, which manages land through the Department of Interior. Then U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and there are a lot of others ones like this. So it is kind of curious, but no, this is not a part of the National Park Service.
What about Congaree? I have not been there, but I see it listed. Paul?
That is indeed a national park. That's a park. I have been there. I have canoed through there. Um, when you come to lists of people who and the internet is filled with and YouTube is filled with little videos of people saying the worst national parks ever or something like that, you often see top tens. That's probably more common, but this one particularly is on the lower list. It's one of the least visited parks. Um, uh, it is ostensibly a forest where you canoe through it. You hardly can walk through it. Yeah, I don't know whether you'd call it a swamp or what exactly geographically it would be called, but it's uh, old growth forest, and canoeing would be the most interesting thing you would do there.
You used the word swamp, and I did a little research myself. I haven't been there, but I see it was the Congaree Swamp National Monument. Just doesn't sound that attractive, and I guess it is in a very remote, difficult to get to place, and that makes it the least visited of all national parks. It's in South Carolina.
Yeah, at least in the lower 48. The actual least visited in would be there's one in American Samoa, and then of course Gates of the Arctic. Um, and and again, that's parks. Again, there's nothing straightforward. The actual least visited park unit is in Alaska, and it's called Aniakchak, and fewer than 150 people go there on average a year. It's exceedingly difficult to get to. It's on the Aleutian Peninsula, and it is a caldera, and there are absolutely no roads into it. You have to fly in there. Hiking, there is a village not horribly far from there, but because of the terrain and various and sundry things, hiking there is really, or it can be done, but it's not done regularly.
Hmm. Central Park. As I think everyone listening knows, that's a city park in New York. But Paul, is it a national park?
No, but the man who designed it does have a national park unit named after him, Olmsted, and there is a Olmsted National Park unit. I believe it's in New England somewhere. It's one I've not been to, but no, Central Park is not.
And then,
And I might add this is that he was a landscape architect, uh, and he was responsible for some of the designs of certain how roads were engineered into the national park unit so that it would have a greater aesthetic effect.
hot springs. Hot Springs. It sounds like a movie or something. Is that a national park, Paul?
It is in fact a national park, and many people complain that it is because it doesn't seem like it. However, again, owing to the not straightforwardness of these things, actually, Hot Springs is the oldest unit in the national park system. Now, many people will say, well, when did the National Park Service start? Of course, in 1916, that was when the Congressional Act started the actual National Park Service. But most people point to Yellowstone being the first national park in the world, and that would be correct, which is 1872, and Ulysses S. Grant was the president at the time when that happened. However, prior to that, there was federal land set aside for special purposes, which is now Yosemite National Park, but it wasn't called the National Park then. And that was signed off on by Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. But prior to either of those things, in 1832, a mineral springs in Hot Springs was designated as a special federal reserve, and it was called a reserve. And that really is the oldest unit in the National Park Service, 1832. But yes, it is one, and ostensibly it was there because of the hot springs, and then a lot of you know people saw it as a commercial enterprise and decided that they would turn that into a money making for them, and so they had hotels along the area, and there's still a lot of old hotels there. But yes, it is a national park. Curiously enough, there is one other mineral springs in as a part of the National Park Service, and it was one of the original national park units in 1916, and it's a Chickasaw National Recreation Area. It was not called that at the time, for a while there, it was a national park called Platte National Park, but it's in Oklahoma. Yeah, so there are two that were mineral springs set aside for that.
And I'm going to close this little game with one that I don't know if you have ever been to this place, Arnold's Park.
I
I think
have
I
been
got
to
you stumped there.
No, I have been to Arnold's Park. I have.
Uh, it is an amusement park on Lake West Okoboji in northwest Iowa, my old stomping grounds. And that's where we used to always go as a kid. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have been to Arnold's Park, and they'll understand that I just threw that in as a joke.
Well, Quentin, my mother went to Arnold's Park. My mother was born in Iowa, and I'd never hold that against her. I would because she's my mother. But yes, I have been to Arnold's Park on numerous occasions. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. That was fun, and we appreciate your expertise. Are there other examples, other than the ones we've mentioned, that come to your mind as politics entering into the decision to make something a national park, a monument, a historic site, and so forth? Political shenanigans that created ridiculous parks or monuments?
Well, pick one. I mean, as I said, there's so many. There politics enters into many of these because they're competing interests. Um, uh, you, One of the understandings of publicly owned land is kind of a new concept to our country, even, and the idea of that there would be any kind of public land because in uh, ostensibly, the United States got its foundations from European immigrants or colonists to this area, and part of them the land was either privately owned or was owned by the king. Take your pick. It was either royally owned or was privately owned. There was no such thing as, quote, public land. Uh, so that concept of public land is a, I don't want to say a uniquely American idea, but it certainly is an American idea. But then how do you administrate it? How do you manage it? How do you take care of it? Again, what do you use it for? You really have in the federal government, you have two different and sort of competing interests with regard to how to manage federal land. You have the Department of Agriculture and you have the Department of the Interior. The Department of Agriculture tends to see sort of, I hesitate to use the word conservationist, but that's probably not a bad word to describe the general idea, and that is that the Department of Agriculture or federal lands are there to be managed but also used. I mean, many of the national forests have are forested, and they harvest lumber there, and which is something you don't do in a national park. A national park unit's probably what would be more of a preservationist perspective on things. And obviously, they're competing interests because preservationists would not want mining, would not want any kind of forest harvesting on those lands, whereas in a national forest or national grassland, those things may well be permitted. Oftentimes, they abut one another. Like, for example, Yellowstone. Yellowstone is an example of a federal land being managed by two different units. The actual park itself is managed by the Department of Interior through the National Park Service. However, much of the surrounding land are national forests, so managed by Department of Agriculture. Curious thing about that is that there is constantly hubbub, and certainly the annexation of land in I shouldn't say annexation, that might make the wrong term, but the addition of Jackson Hole and Grand Tetons is certainly a great example of political issues going on there. The Grand Tetons are beautiful mountains, and then they abut the National Park of Yellowstone. But the establishment of that was quite controversial, and it wound up in a compromise that whereas the President of the United States can declare any federal land under certain circumstances a national monument, they can't do it in Wyoming without the consent of the state of Wyoming, because as a compromise to letting Grand Teton and the surrounding area become a part of the national park, because there was a pretty ugly fight about that. The compromise was that the federal government agreed that you can't do it anymore use the Antiquities Act in Wyoming, and it's the only state that has that provision. Another big fight, more recent than that, was in Alaska. The vast majority of national park lands in terms of acreage are in Alaska, like many things else. Well, Jimmy Carter, with one stroke of the pen, did a significant amount of national park additions, and created quite a controversy. The people of Alaska, if you had asked the people of Alaska whether they want all this land being put into the National Park Service, they would have objected severely. So this wasn't necessarily a democratic process. It might have been done by a Democrat, but it was not a democratic process. They certainly didn't think so. Now, of course, if you were to ask anybody in the lower 48 if should this happen, it might have been a very different vote, because it's the whole not in my backyard kind of thing. Oddly enough, people have changed their minds on that. There was some concern, but people who live in remote places tend to be very independent. I mean, I'll give North Dakota as an example. North Dakota is, very independently minded people here, and they pride themselves in that. I would say Alaskans are very similar in that regard. They tend to be very independently minded people, and they don't want someone coming in and telling you what to do with their land. And again, who's to say? So those were two examples of how national park units came into being with a lot of controversy.
I've heard about the Teapot Dome scandal in the
Yeah.
1920s, kind of famous in American history. And my understanding is the Secretary of Interior
Yes.
leased Navy petroleum reserves, including the Teapot Dome in Wyoming, to
Correct.
oil companies at low rates. Is there anything like that still going on?
I don't think so. I don't. I know, there's again, you'd mentioned the Bears Ears controversy. That kind of goes back and forth because uh, there's even now some suggestion. Well, uh, actually, one of the most beautiful national parks around, uh, Grand Canyon, was surrounded in political controversy. It was not one of the original national parks.
Really?
It wasn't a park at the time of the national parks founding in 1916, but it was shortly thereafter. But a very powerful man who later became, I think, one of the first U.S. senators from Arizona, had a lot of mining interests there, and there's even some discussion about mining there. Another mining interest issue has to do with Canyonlands National Park in Utah, largely because there's a lot of uranium in that area, and uh, which, a strategic interest, you would think, and so you have these conflicting interests between those things. But I would say that I don't know of anything like that. I mean, um, uh, in my mind, the biggest issue with regard to politics in the national parks, I would kind of see as uh, what's happened in the last 30 years. Just let me give you a quick example. In the last 30 years, since Bill Clinton was president, and starting in 1994. He started, was it 92? Was he elected, or I can't
I
remember.
believe so.
92. But so starting with his presidency, 67 national park units have been added to the National Park Service. 67 of 433. I don't know what the math is on that, but it does seem like a lot in 30 years. Um, but 67. Of those 67, 11 were added during the administrations of George W. Bush and the first administration of Donald Trump. Um, that would mean that the others of that 67 were all added by either Clinton, Obama, and Joe Biden. Um, and when you look through them, they're mostly what might be distinguished as cultural or historical, and depends upon whose understanding of cultural and historical. The National Park Service has a list on their website of these. It's a very nice little list, explains which each of them are. But you kind of go through the list and you say, really, what's up with that? And again, one of the more curious things has to do with national park units that pertain to memorializing presidents. Uh,
Really?
yes, there are 35 national park units which pertain to memorializing presidents. Now, you might say to yourself, well, there have been 45 presidents. That leaves most of them on there. Well, actually, that's not true, because many of the national park units memorializing presidents are, I don't want to say duplicates, but uh, uh, George Washington has four for sure, and possibly another four more. Teddy Roosevelt has like five or six. Uh, 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 Franklin Roosevelt has four. Abraham Lincoln has five or six. So what about Lyndon Johnson has two? Now, I mentioned Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson used to have a national park unit named for himself, Fort Jefferson, in the Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America, as it's currently being said to be. Speaking of political decisions, uh, but it's now called Dry Tortuga, but it's not called Jefferson. Fort Jefferson. It was called Fort Jefferson at one time, but now it's called Dry Tortuga. Uh, uh, Thomas Jefferson also was memorialized by the Gateway Arch, because it was the Jefferson expansion. It's not called that anymore. It's called, the Gateway. Now the only national park unit honoring Thomas Jefferson is the Jefferson Memorial. I guess you couldn't change the name of that. But why is it that Lyndon Johnson has two national park units honoring him? In whose teaching of the United States of America would Lyndon Johnson get twice the recognition of Thomas Jefferson? What insanity is that? Uh, there's some craziness that goes on there, but it gets more interesting. Up until just this year, there were two presidentially honoring national park units to living presidents, to Jimmy Carter and William Jefferson Clinton. Really? I mean, two to living presidents? That seems a little much. And I mean, I understand why you might want to honor Jimmy Carter if you happen to be the National Park Service, because he certainly did a lot to advance and expand the National Park Service. There's no question about that, particularly in Alaska. The folks in Alaska might have a different view of that. But Bill Clinton, uh, why would you have it? Well, it's his boyhood home. I mean, if you're, fans of Democratic presidents, I guess you'd want that to happen. But as I said, they're the only two examples I know of where living presidents had national park units named in honor of them. And I could be wrong on that. There may have been other situations where a living president had a national park unit in honor of them. But be that as it may, presidential units, uh, well, I think those two speak for themselves right there. Also, only 20 presidents are honored out of those 30 some, and there have been 45 presidents. So the probably the most unusual name on the list of presidents not honored by a national park unit would be James Madison. It would seem to me that somewhere you'd want to stick James Madison in there as a significant founding father, and somehow you'd want him honored. But and Monroe is only honored because of Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is a national park service unit, but is it really honoring Monroe, or is it honoring the fort, which served a significant role in the Civil War, which was where Jefferson Davis was incarcerated after the Civil War? So it's crazy. As I said, nothing is straightforward in this.
Well, if we ever get a president from Wisconsin, maybe they'll make Madison, Wisconsin, a national park or a
Uh,
national monument or something like
Again,
that.
there's no shortage of Madisons throughout the United States.
That's for sure. So, what I'd like to close with is about the status of the national parks today, as far
Yes.
as the services that they're offering. I've read that the Doge cuts this year hit the National Park Service. Firings, early retirement, job freezes. Uh, I heard that the employment ranks of the National Park Service were reduced by nearly a quarter, and that this summer, half the number of seasonal workers needed, and there are many, were still not hired as of July. Now, I know you have been to national parks even this summer.
Yep.
How are things going in the parks this year from your standpoint, purely as a visitor?
Well, I'm going to, I visited the Muir Woods in California, which is absolutely one of the most beautiful parks you could possibly imagine. It's in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the bathrooms were filthy. Just no getting around it. They were just absolutely filthy. And that's just I haven't been there before, so I have no means of comparison, but I can say that it was absolutely filthy, which is a shame because it's a beautiful, beautiful place. It was probably one of the most serene experiences I've ever had in a national park. Just absolutely gorgeous. Um, the big challenge is that national park units, um, have their services cut back. So how do you schedule yourself? Because whereas before many units were open, 7 days a week, now many of them are been cut back in that regard. And again, I don't know the exact nature of all that scheduling. Maybe it was before, maybe it was after. It's hard to say. I was able to do my schedule. So I mean, if you work hard at it, you certainly can do it. I recognize that if you're going to make federal cuts, you need to make federal cuts. I get that. I understand that. The other thing is this, Quentin, that we've not discussed is that the delisting of national parks, getting things off the national park rolls, which would, of course, be very controversial. But in that same 30-year period, there have been 2 national park units that have been delisted. The Kennedy Center was delisted under Clinton. The Kennedy Center used to be a part of the National Park Service, but then it was delisted and moved to its own separate entity. And the Oklahoma City bombing memorial also was delisted, and now is again its own separate thing. There are park rangers on site there, but I visited there earlier this year, and my wife being a federal worker, having worked in a federal building, that's very meaningful to her, and having going there was a very meaningful moment. As I said, it could have just as easily been the federal building she worked at as it could have been the one in Oklahoma, and but that was delisted. But they're not the only ones that have ever been delisted. As a matter of fact, the second unit that was officially recognized as a national park, which would be Mackinac National Park, Mackinac, which basically is Mackinac Island, was founded as a park in 1875, 3 years after Yellowstone. So that's interesting. And then it was delisted before the Park Service even became a park. It became a part of the state parks of state of Michigan. So that was one. Then here in North Dakota, a national park was delisted, and it was a part of the original 37 units of the National Park Service. It was Sully's Hill National Park, not terribly far from Devil's Lake, North Dakota, and it was delisted. It's no longer. It's actually a part of the Fish and Wildlife. It was supposed to be a game preserve, and so it had been delisted. And there are any number of other parks that have been delisted from the National Park Service, some of them which are no longer federal land at all in any way, shape, or form. So it has happened. As to the exact number, I've heard 26 units have been delisted. So that's another thing. But boy, I don't want to be around when someone suggests that happening. Goodness gracious, the hue and cry of the locals when their park getting delisted. Boy, they just have a cow to that. The bigger problem is I mean, this really is, in my mind, the bigger problem. When you can declare something a national monument under the Antiquities Act as President of the United States, but only Congress can provide the funding for it. And early on, that was a problem, is that people would declare these things as national park units without any kind of funding to go with them. And it proved to be problematic. And I think that's probably the bigger problem. And the bigger problem is the overuse of the Antiquities Act. I'll just say that. That's again, as I said, I'm a hobbyist with an opinion. I think the Antiquities Act in recent years has been excessively used, and that has caused problems, particularly for the budget. As far as I'm concerned, I think the full funding of national parks is a high priority for me, because I believe in the national parks, and I think they provide our country with an amazing resource which is available to all people. It is truly a democratic idea, so that the people, regardless of who you are, can experience this sort of beauty that in other places in the world wasn't the case. And this is, again, a uniquely American idea. And so in the sense that the National Park Service provides this uniquely American idea, I think we need to really examine carefully how we fund this and make sure that those park units that have been set aside need that funding and are cared for. The question is, what do we do with the things that we can discuss? I mean, I could give you three parks right off the bat, which I'd say, well, you might want to have rethought that ahead of time, but it's tough to close the barn door after the cows got out. That's the hardest part.
For sure. I've often said in my big belief in limited government that the federal government should only provide us things that only the federal government can provide.
Yeah.
And in a sense, these are not just national parks, they're federal parks. And,
Yes.
and I'm a big believer in that is one of the things that really only a federal government can provide as a national park
Yeah.
and give us parks and interstate highways
Sure.
and a military and a federal court system for resolving our disputes and a few other things that only the federal government can do. And then that's the role of the federal government in my mind. Now, the National Park Service has had the highest favorability of any federal agency. 76% as recently as 2024, and possibly rivaled only by the people that run the national cemeteries,
Yes.
such as the one here in the Twin Cities or Arlington Cemetery and those kind of things.
Right.
Uh, Republicans and Democrats both are huge fans of these parks in roughly equal measure. It's one of the few things that if you poll Republicans and Democrats, do you think there should be, and do you like the national parks? They'll say yes, and I find that very, very interesting and comforting. There were 332 million visitors to our national parks last year. Will politics diminish this national love for our national parks as, politics has diminished so many other things in our country, Paul?
That'd be tough to do. Um, I say you could only step to the crest of the Grand Canyon once, and for the first time.
That's
I remember
pretty impressive.
I remember in 1981 doing that thing for the first time. I've been back several times, um, but that experience you can't put in a painting, you can't put in a video, you can't put in a photograph, you can't put in a poem. You cannot put that experience of stepping up to the Grand Canyon for the first time. It is just, it transcends our ability to speak of it. Um, Going into the Hayden Valley in Yellowstone and seeing these vast herds of bison can only trigger your imagination of what this country was at one time. Nostalgia is a powerful emotion in people. Nostalgia it transcends reason, and much of what we understand the national parks to be is largely predicated upon a strong feeling of nostalgia, and that transcends politics. It truly does. And when you go to a place like Teddy Roosevelt, I personally believe, not simply because I live in North Dakota, but I believe that Teddy Roosevelt is sort of pound per pound the hidden gem of the National Park Service. I hate to say that because then people will go there and clog it up with traffic. But it's a smaller unit, but it encompasses scenic beauty. It encompasses geological formations. It encompasses historic fauna. It encompasses history, and it encompasses the human experience of a man who went away to grieve the loss of both his wife and mother, and that man was Teddy Roosevelt. And him, along with other individuals such as John Muir and others, caught this idea, caught this vision about what this should be. Now, to be sure, there had already been um, national parks there at that time that Roosevelt had done this. The area had already been, the Yellowstone had been established. Yosemite had still been a reservation. Hot Springs. It's not like they invented the idea, but they caught on to the idea. And for me, that's a place that inspires this bigger vision. So, no, I don't think that politics can completely diminish it. Over time, people will come to the realization that this isn't the worst thing in the world. Uh, uh, the Can I Ford situation is an example of that. The local people opposed it tremendously when it was being turned into this national monument, ultimately a national park. Now it's a gold mine for them. I mean, people come, all over the world to see Kenai Fjords, and it's an amazing national park in Alaska. So I think that, as I said, when a person experiences these places, they understand the importance of these places, and regardless of who they are.
Well, you've preached it, Pastor Paul,
Yep.
and I believe. So we thank you for your appearance here. This will conclude episode 8 of the Extremely Non-Extreme podcast. This podcast is a product of principle-based-politics.org. Principle-based-politics.org. You can subscribe on our YouTube channel or subscribe at principle-based-politics.org, and I will send you each notice and link when a new podcast episode is produced, as well as the blog that Principle Based Politics publishes on a regular basis. So thank you all for your attention, and thank you again, Paul Cross.
Thank you for having me.